The summer heat of 1887 clung to the wooden porches and dust-beaten roads of the little village, a place where the church bell tolled louder than gossip yet never drowned it out. Folks here lived close to the land and closer still to the stories. They whispered stories that carried both pride and warning. It was the kind of town where every stranger's bootprint in the dirt was studied, and every shadow that lingered too long by the stable stirred unease. Yet, one evening, something happened that no watchful eye had seen coming, and its ripple would stretch through lives in ways no one dared speak aloud. That evening began quietly enough. The sun was low, its fire melting into the ridges of the five western hills, while the scent of horse leather and chimney smoke hung over the narrow lanes. The inn at the village edge, built with rough-cut logs and creaking floors, was filled with the hum of tired travelers. Among them was an Apache scout, tall, quiet, carrying with him the weariness of miles and the weight of being looked upon with suspicion by those who barely knew his name. He sought only rest that night, a simple bed after days spent on the trail. The air was thick, the lanterns burned low, and nothing in his mind hinted at what the night would become. Upstairs, behind thin walls, another story stirred. A young girl of the village, barely more than a woman but not yet hardened by the burdens of marriage, slipped into the hush of her room. Her life had always been a narrow path, lined with expectations set by others. Obedience to her parents, devotion to her church, silence where her own dreams might have spoken. Yet in her chest beat a restless longing, something unformed but undeniable. The inn was no stranger to her. She had grown up within its shadow, but that night the quiet seemed different, charged with an unease she could not name. It was in that charged silence that a mistake was made, a confusion born of dim light, weary eyes, and the frail barriers of old timber between rooms. What began as a weary man collapsing into what he believed was his bed became something else entirely. She, frozen by fear and uncertainty, pretended to be asleep, as if stillness itself could shield her from consequence. But stillness could not undo what had been set in motion, and by morning the world had shifted beneath her feet. The village awoke to its ordinary rhythm, roosters crowing, wagons rattling down the dirt street, women carrying buckets to the well. Yet behind one girl's downcast eyes was a truth too heavy for her to carry, and behind the Apache's silence was a confusion he could not voice. Neither spoke of what had happened. To the villagers, nothing seemed amiss, but beneath the quiet surfaces of daily life, a secret had already taken root. And secrets, in a place where nothing stayed hidden for long, were like sparks in dry grass. Days stretched into weeks. The girl's parents noticed her distracted gaze, her faintness at dawn. Neighbors began to murmur, their whispers weaving threads of suspicion even before there was proof to bind them. The Apache returned to his work, his face unreadable, though. Every glance cast in his direction seemed heavier than before. The town, bound by its rigid codes of honor and shame, would not be merciful if the truth were revealed. The weight of judgment was already gathering, waiting for the chance to fall. Still, in the quiet corners of her heart, the girl wrestled not only with fear but with something more complicated. She had not chosen the path she now walked, yet within her grew a life that demanded acknowledgement. The village preached virtue, but it had little room for compassion when rules were broken. She knew what awaited her if she confessed, yet silence felt just as dangerous. And so she lived in a constant hush, her secret pressed tight against her ribs, praying for a way forward that did not end in ruin. The Apache, too, began to sense the stirrings of change. He was a man who had known battlefields and barren deserts, but he had never known the strange weight of being bound to another life by accident, nor the fear of bringing shame upon one who had not deserved it. Though he carried himself with quiet strength, there were nights when he lay awake, listening to the distant howl of coyotes, and wondered if the spirits had tied his fate to hers for reasons beyond his understanding. He had made a mistake, yes, but was it only mistake, or something that destiny itself had woven into place? As autumn crept in, painting the fields with gold and fire, the girl's secret became harder to disguise. Loose dresses could not hide what her body had begun to reveal. She walked with lowered eyes, but the village eyes were sharp. Old women at the well fell silent when she passed. Men on porches glanced too long, and still she said nothing. Still, he said nothing. The silence itself became louder than words. Everyone felt the tension before they could name it, as if a storm cloud had gathered above the town and waited heavy, ready to burst out by the time the first frost came. She knew there would be no more hiding. The truth was etched across her in ways that could no longer be denied. Her parents, bewildered and broken by the realization, sought explanations and prayers and punishments, but answers would not come so easily. The Apache, for his part, kept his silence even as guilt and duty gnawed at him. Their two worlds, hers bound by rigid virtue, his shaped by survival and the weight of being an outsider, were about to collide in ways that neither had wished for, but neither could escape. The village, always quick to turn rumor into judgment, was ready to brand them both before either had spoken. And so, the story that began with a mistake, with one night blurred by shadows and fear, had become something larger than the two of them. It had become a tale of shame and survival, of honor and exile, of how one child not yet born could carry the burden of an entire town's prejudice. The air grew colder, the whispers sharper, and every day brought them closer to the moment when silence would no longer be enough. And on one bitter evening, as the wind swept through the bare branches, and the church bell tolled across the frozen ground, the girl stood trembling at the threshold of confession. Her secret was no longer hers to hold. The Apache, standing at the edge of the village, watched the smoke curl from chimneys and knew that his choice, whatever it might be, would bind his life to hers in a way no road could ever undo. The night was waiting. The town was watching, and the truth was ready to step from shadow into light, whether they were prepared for it or not. The bell's echo lingered in the cold air long after its toll had ended, as if the sound itself carried the weight of judgment. The young woman stood in the dim light of her family's porch, her hands folded against her stomach, feeling the faint stir of the child within her. She had not spoken, not to her parents, not to the townsfolk, not even to herself in words she could bear to repeat. The silence had become a prison, yet she clung to it, knowing that once truth escaped her lips, there would be no turning back. Behind her, the shutters creaked with a draft, and the whispers of her mother's prayers reached her ears like distant cries. Life in the village had always moved in cycles, slow and predictable as the turning of the seasons. The men worked the fields and mended their fences. The women sewed and carried the weight of keeping order, and the children grew up with the same expectations waiting for them. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, secrets lay buried like stones, under the soil, hidden until the plow uncovered them. And this secret, the one swelling inside her, was a stone too large to stay hidden much longer. Her parents had begun to notice the changes, though they spoke of them in hushed tones. Her mother's eyes grew weary with questions she dared not ask, and her father's silence at the dinner table was heavier than words. They knew what such a thing meant in a place like this. A daughter bearing a child without a name to claim. It was not just a scandal, it was a mark that could shadow an entire family. The girl had grown up under their roof obeying rules that were older than she was, rules that came not just from the Bible, but from the stern eyes of neighbors who believed themselves keepers of right and wrong. The Apache went about his days, quietly, as he always had. He worked where his hands were needed, mending tack, carrying supplies, scouting trails for travelers who didn't trust him yet needed his knowledge of the land. The townsfolk tolerated him because he was useful, but their glances lingered too long, their voices dropped when he walked past. He carried it without complaint, though inside he knew the ground beneath him would never truly be home. He had learned long ago that belonging was not granted to a man like him. It had to be carved out in silence. Yet lately, that silence gnawed at him. The weight of what had happened pressed against him at night, as though the earth itself reminded him of the debt he owed. Rumors had already begun to stir, though not yet tied to her name. The village was small, and nothing passed unnoticed for long. The women at the well had whispered of her faintness, of her tired steps. The men outside the blacksmith's shop muttered that the Apache had grown too familiar with the inn's upper rooms. None spoke outright, but suspicion does not need words to grow. It spreads like smoke, curling into every corner until no air feels clean. The girl tried to keep to herself, avoiding the markets, the church socials, the gatherings where sharp eyes lingered too long. Yet her absence was just as loud as her presence would have been. People noticed when someone withdrew, and they made their own stories to fill the silence. Some said she was ill, others that her parents were keeping her hidden out of shame. None of them knew the truth, but their guesses edged closer with each passing day. She lay awake at night, staring at the rafters above her bed, her hands pressed against her growing belly. Fear was her closest companion, yet woven into that fear was something she could not quite name. A flicker of defiance, perhaps, or a quiet strength rising in her that she did not recognize. The child she carried was not one she had chosen, but it was hers now, bound to her by blood and breath. And though the weight of shame pressed heavily on her, she felt the stirring of something more, something that made her question the walls the village had built around her life. The Apache, too, was restless. He had not spoken to her since that night, though their paths crossed often enough in the narrow lanes of the village. Each time her eyes dropped, and his face remained carved from stone. Yet behind that stillness was turmoil. He had not meant for it to happen, yet it had, and now a life was tied to his. The rules of his people were different from those of the village, but honor was no less sacred. To abandon responsibility was to invite shame not only on himself, but on those who had walked before him. Still, he was no fool. He knew that stepping forward would not bring peace. It would only ignite the fires of prejudice that already smoldered beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The church sermon seemed sharper, the glances colder. Her father's silence deepened into something harsher, a distance she could not bridge. Her mother, though softer, seemed trapped between love for her daughter and fear of what was coming. The girl began to feel as though she stood on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her, with nowhere safe to land. One evening, as the frost settled across the rooftops, she wandered to the edge of the fields where the tall grass swayed in the moonlight. There, away from the village eyes, she allowed herself to cry, the sound carried away by the wind. She thought of running, of slipping beyond the hills where no one knew her name. But the world beyond was wide and cruel, and she was not sure she had the strength to survive it alone. Still, the thought clung to her, a faint promise of escape. Though it frightened her as much as it comforted her. The Apache watched her from a distance that night, unseen, his heart torn between approaching and keeping his silence. He knew the storm was coming, that the truth would not remain hidden much longer. He wondered what would happen when it broke, whether she would be cast out, whether he would be driven away, whether the child would be cursed by both worlds. And yet, in that uncertainty, there was also something else. A pull he could not resist, a sense that their fates had been bound together for reasons neither of them could yet see. The village itself seemed to sense the unrest. The air grew heavy with the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, when even the animals grow restless. Doors closed earlier, conversations hushed quicker. People spoke of sin and justice with sharper tones, though no names were spoken. It was as if everyone knew something was brewing, though no one dared to face it head-on. Winter pressed harder with each passing week. Snow fell and covered the dirt roads, but the cold could not mask the heat of suspicion burning through the village. The girl grew heavier with child, her steps slower, her eyes dimmer with worry. The Apache grew quieter still, though his presence seemed larger, more weighted, as if every movement he made was measured against the judgment waiting to fall. By the time the year's end drew near, the line between secrecy and revelation had grown thin. One more whisper, one more glance, and the truth would spill into the open. And in a place like this, truth was not a gentle thing, it was a blade. The girl knew it. The Apache knew it. The whole village, though they did not yet say it, was waiting for it. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the world knew that when the silence finally broke, nothing would ever be the same again. Snow lay crusted along the rutted road, and the village carried on under a sky the color of tin. The church bell no longer sounded like guidance. It sounded like a reminder that someone was always watching. The young woman rose before dawn to light the stove and keep her hands busy, as if labor could keep the truth from hardening around her. Her mother hovered close, asking simple questions about sleep and appetite, avoiding the questions that mattered. Her father's boots thumped the porch boards each morning and returned late with mud frozen along the saws. He ate in silence and stared past his plate, as if the horizon might offer an answer that never came. The Apache kept to the edges. He worked where he was asked, trading trail work for food and shelter, staying in the loft above the stable when the inn was full. Some days he drifted outside town to check the high paths and low fordings where winter currents cut through ice. He carried a leather pouch he never left behind, a small bundle of herbs and bits of stone. He would touch it when no one was looking, a private tether to the ways that shaped him before this village ever learned his face. There was calm in the river's sound and in the wind that combed the pines, but calm did not follow him back through the main street. He could feel judgment in the cold the way a horse senses a storm long before the first drop falls. The first crack in the quiet came at the well. Two women drew buckets, their talk stitching together the little facts that everyone already knew. The girl was not often seen but was always tired. Her dresses hung loose and yet were not loose enough. One said there ought to be a wedding if there was to be a baby. The other said a wedding required a name and no one had offered one. When the girl came to the well, their voices dipped, then rose again as she left, softer but harder too. By sundown, the blacksmith had heard and the carpenter had heard, and the words took on a shape all their own. A secret can be a breath of wind. A rumor becomes a wall. The preacher kept a ledger as neat as his sermons. He believed order saved souls, and he feared this trouble would become a contagion. He visited the girl's parents, his hat in his hands, and spoke of forgiveness in careful tones. He did not ask for names, yet every pause felt like a question. He said the church would help if help was sought in the right manner. He said shame could be lifted by truth. He never said what would happen if the truth was the wrong one for the people who would hear it. When he left, the mother folded in on herself at the table, and the father walked out into the white field with no coat. His breath a ragged cloud. At the edge of town lived a midwife, with hands that had delivered more children than anyone could count. Some said she practiced only what the Lord allowed. Others said her knowledge came from the woods and the long memory of women. The girl found her by following a narrow track behind the mill, where the snow gave way to ground stamped by birds and mule hooves. The little cabin smelled of juniper and smoke. The midwife looked at the girl's face first, then at her hands and the way she held herself in the chair. She asked no questions about men or mistakes. She asked about sleep and pain and whether the girl felt the child turn. The girl lied once, then twice, then stopped lying when the midwife's eyes said there was no need. When the girl left, she carried tea wrapped in a cloth and a warning that winter births could be hard. She also carried the sense that someone in this village saw her as more than a trespass against rules. There were others dragging their own weights behind them. A ranch hand missing 2 fingers from last spring's cedar clearing wanted to marry the girl. He had little to offer besides a steady back and a plot of ground that turned up more stone than crop, but he thought goodness might carry them. He spoke to the father in halting phrases and offered to give the child a name that was not his. The father stared for a long time at the yard where wagon ruts had frozen into ribs. He shook his head. He did not explain. Perhaps the refusal came from pride. Perhaps it came from the way the girl's eyes never lifted when the ranch hand stood near. A trader passed through with a wagon loaded under tarps. He would sell anything if the price was right, from needles to rifles. He knew every mile of trail, and every name worth knowing from the fort to the river settlements. Over a tin cup of coffee, he told the blacksmith that the Army Scouts were restless after a string of thefts north of the ridge. He said trouble had a habit of dropping where people already expected to find it. The blacksmith grunted, turning a horseshoe in the forge. The heat washed over his face and made his scowl look like a brand. When the trader mentioned the Apache who had been working the ferry road, the blacksmith said a man who kept his head down usually had a reason. One late morning the sheriff rode in from a circuit and hitched his mount by the general store. He was a careful man who liked facts lined up neat as cartridges. Folks told him half things, quarter things, pieces smoothed by fear. He heard the same name spoken without being spoken. He tested the air as a hunter tests his boot on spring ice. He walked to the livery, not fast, not slow, and found the Apache rubbing down a sorrel mare. "You been here all week?" the sheriff asked. The Apache said he had, voice flat as river stone. The sheriff gestured at the loft. The Apache said he slept there. "No lantern after nightfall?" the sheriff asked. The Apache's jaw worked once before he said no. The sheriff nodded and turned away. Truth had been offered, but truth had not been believed. A seed does not ask permission to take root. By then the girl's mother had begun to prepare in secret, cutting and sewing as if doing so could build a wall no one could see. She stitched tiny shirts by lamplight while the girl pretended to read the Bible beside her. The verses blurred on the page. The mother's needle moved, steady as a clock. The father's boots still struck their dull rhythm, though he had begun to spend nights in the barn, claiming a sick calf needed tending. The smell of hay and manure clung to him. He kept a bottle tucked beside the feed chest and took it up, like a man taking up a shovel. If a person could dig through winter, he would have done it. The Apache carried his own map of the past, a map made of ridges where he learned to follow elk, of high flats where rain came sideways, of camps where samps were. Elders taught duty with few words. Honor was a path that did not bend to comfort. Each night, he pictured walking to the girl's door and standing in the open where all could see. He pictured saying, "I am the one." He pictured the faces that would greet him. He pictured the long road afterward, a road with no shelter. He could bear exile. He had walked it before. What he feared was leaving the girl and the child to the worst of the village. He feared becoming the reason for their pain more than he already had. So he waited, and waiting felt like a kind of cowardice that stung more than frost. The preacher's worry turned practical. He proposed a charity supper for the late winter, a chance to gather and feed those who needed feeding while also smoothing the fear that made people cruel. He wrote notices in his careful hand and sent boys door to door. The event would raise funds for repairs to the church roof, but everyone knew the roof would survive, and what truly needed mending was thinner than shingles. The girl's mother baked bread for the supper. The father delivered wood. The Apache helped set tables behind the hall and stack split logs by the door. He worked quietly. No one thanked him, but no one sent him away either. Mercy sometimes looks like not being told to leave. The night of the supper was clear and bitter. Lanterns threw soft circles onto the snow. Voices hummed in the hall, not quite joyful but not yet sharpening. The girl stood near the back, a shawl drawn around her shoulders, watching steam rise from the stew pot. Children slid on the packed snow outside and laughed until a mother pulled them in by their collars. The sheriff talked with the blacksmith and the storekeeper. The preacher moved like a patient shepherd, filling plates and pressing extra bread into hands that looked thin. When the Apache brought in an armful of wood, conversation dipped, then resumed. A woman touched her throat and whispered to her neighbor that it was a strange thing to see him doing the Lord's work. Her neighbor said wood was wood no matter whose hands carried it. After the bowls were cleared, the preacher spoke for a few minutes. He used words like burden and compassion and community. He said there were times when a body must carry more than it could alone. He said neighbors were a kind of family when real families were worn smooth. He did not look toward the girl, but the girl felt the words land on her like snow. Light, then heavier, then cold through to the skin. Before the preacher finished, an older man near the stove barked that he would not be asked to forgive what he did not yet know. He said secrets made fools of honest men. He said harsh truths were better than soft lies. The hall went quiet. The preacher lifted his hands and let them fall. The moment passed, but something had been said aloud that would not be unsaid. In the weeks after the supper, the village began moving in small orbits around the same center. The ranch hand brought wood again and again, as if persistence could become destiny. The midwife came twice to the house and left through the side gate. The sheriff watched and waited. The preacher prayed and planned. The blacksmith hammered and muttered. The trader passed back through, leaving a rattle of rumors behind his wagon like broken chain. The Apache took jobs that kept him moving. He mended a fence line above the creek and set snares for a widow whose chickens had vanished to foxes. He was useful in a dozen invisible ways. Usefulness did not change the stories told over stew. A windstorm roared down from the ridge and tore a section of roof from the inn. Shingles skittered across the road like thrown cards. The Apache climbed the ladder and worked with the innkeeper's son to nail fresh shake into place. The girl watched from the alley, hidden from the road by a stack of split wood. She felt the old fear rise with the old pull. She did not know if she wanted him to look down and see her. He did not look down. He drove the last nail and tested the fit with his palm. When he climbed to the ground, he hesitated at the corner where the alley met the street. He did not turn his head, yet he knew she was there. He left without a word. The space between them felt like a rope drawn tight. Any jerk might snap it. The girl's father found the ranch hand in the stable a few days later and told him not to come back. He spoke in a voice rubbed raw. The ranch hand nodded and tried to meet his eyes, then failed and settled for looking at the saddle rack. "You are not the answer," the father said. The ranch hand asked who was. The father said nothing and left. The ranch hand stood for a long time under the hayloft and listened to the wind push through the cracks. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a fool, and he could tell when a choice had been made for him. Another track began to show itself then, faint as deer trace under new snow. Children at the schoolhouse repeated words they heard at home. A boy told another that some folk did not belong and never would. A girl asked the teacher why the preacher spoke of sin without names. The teacher, young and stubborn, told them that mercy was a bigger word than blame. She kept an eye on the girl when she ventured out, offering a place at the school stove and a cup of watered milk. She looked at the Apache once with a level gaze when he passed the schoolyard, and he tipped his hat. Small acts do not change a village, but they change a day. The main conflict now rode inside every ordinary hour. The child growing within the girl was a promise and a threat depending on who spoke. The Apache's presence was a debt and a defense depending on who watched. The father's silence was protection and surrender. The mother's sewing was care and denial. The preacher's sermons were balm and kindling. The sheriff's patience was wisdom and delay. The midwife's knowledge was salvation and a sign. Every person held a piece of the fire and a little water, and no one could decide which to use. Late one afternoon, the river ice cracked like a gunshot. Men ran to the bank and pulled a steer out with ropes while the animal screamed and steam poured from its flank. The Apache tied off his line and leaned back hard, boots skidding on ice. The sheriff braced the rope and barked orders. The steer staggered to shore and collapsed, eyes rolling. For a moment there was only breath and effort and the hard fact of keeping something alive. Then the moment passed, and people returned to what they had been thinking before. Still, the sheriff filed the picture away. 2 men on 1 rope. The girl dreamed of running again. In the dream she walked the ridge road, and the child inside her grew light as breath. No one followed and no one watched, and the wind did not carry her name. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a stitch in her side that did not fade. The midwife pressed cool cloths to her skin and said the body remembers what the mind chooses not to say. The girl did not know if she was being told to speak or simply being told she was not alone in knowing. It was something either way. When thaw finally hinted at itself, the roads turned to ruts and the roofs began to shed their long rows of teeth. The village stretched as if coming out of a cramped posture. Seeds were measured into sacks. Plow handles were patched. Men talked of weather and yield and money with the relief of safe topics. Yet even as spring crept in, the older conflict did not loosen. It only found new places to live, like water, running into different cracks when the ground shifted. One night, wind carried smoke from the hall across the square. The preacher had called for another gathering, this one to plan the planting schedule for the common fields and to organize aid for families short on seed. The girl and her mother came together, wrapped tight against the chill. The Apache stood outside the circle of lantern light near the stacked barrels. The sheriff noticed and said nothing. The blacksmith noticed and rolled his jaw. A few men muttered at the edge of the group. The preacher began to speak of labor and shared tools and the need to guard the fields from early frost. He spoke fast, perhaps to outrun the words everyone else wanted to say. Then from the doorway an older woman, face lined like dry riverbed, said the village must put things right before it could plant straight. She said babies deserved names. She said shame should not be asked to walk alongside the plow. No one answered for a long beat. In that beat, the girl felt the village turn its head toward her without turning bodies. She could feel the look like wind on skin. The Apache's hand closed around the leather pouch at his belt. The sheriff shifted his weight as if preparing to step forward or to hold someone else back. Even he did not know which. The preacher lifted his chin and opened his mouth to speak, and the hall door breathed cold air as it swung wider. The night had come in with a crowd of questions, and the answers waited just outside the lantern's ring. The hall grew quiet after the old woman's words, and the silence spread like fire along dry grass. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but everyone felt the weight of what had been said. The girl stood at the back, her shawl pulled tight, her face lowered. Though she knew the eyes of the village were fixed on her, she could hear the sharp sound of her own heartbeat, louder than the preacher's voice when he tried to smooth the moment. He spoke of patience and of tending to the land, of trust in the Lord's timing. His words rose and fell like a prayer, but they could not bury what had been unearthed. The sheriff shifted near the doorway, his presence heavy without him saying a word. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for truth to rise on its own. Now that it had, he looked from the girl to the Apache standing in the shadows outside, his hand on the worn leather pouch at his belt. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, not in judgment but in calculation. He was a man who measured, who lined facts up in order. Tonight, though, the facts were tangled, and he could see the storm gathering in the faces around the room. The blacksmith was the first to break. His voice cut through the hall, low and sharp, saying there was no honor in keeping secrets that brought shame to every doorstep. His words carried the weight of his hammer, and others nodded, murmuring agreement. A few women hushed him, saying the Lord teaches compassion, but the murmur of the crowd leaned heavier toward anger than mercy. The girl felt the air grow colder, though the fire still burned hot in the stove. Her mother's hand trembled against her sleeve. Her father stared at the floor, unmoving, as if turning to stone might protect him from what was about to come. The Apache stood still, his shadow long across the snow. He had not planned to step forward, not here, not now. Yet he felt the rope tighten inside him, pulling hard. His chest rose and fell, his mind torn between silence and speech. He knew if he claimed what was his, they would cast him out, maybe worse. He knew if he said nothing, the girl would bear the full weight alone. Honor had no easy path. He closed his hand tighter around the pouch at his belt, feeling the smooth edges of stone, grounding himself in what his people had taught him long before this village tried to break him. The preacher raised his voice, louder now, saying that judgment belonged not to man but to God. Yet his voice trembled, and all in the hall heard it. He feared the tide, just as the girl did, just as her parents did. A tide once rising does not easily fall. The old woman by the stove shook her head, muttering that truth ignored only festers deeper. Her words were not loud, yet they struck, as hard as the blacksmith's had before. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters. The sound carried through the hall, and for a brief moment all listened, as though the night itself warned them of what was coming. The lanterns flickered, shadows bending across the walls. The girl thought of running again, of slipping into the dark, but she knew there was no place left to hide. The village was awake now, its hunger for answers sharp as a blade. When the meeting ended, no one lingered as they once did, laughing and trading small stories. They filed out in tight groups, voices hushed, glances sharp. The girl and her mother walked home together, her father trailing behind, a man lost in his own. Silence. The sheriff followed at a distance, his hat low, watching both the road and the shadows. The Apache did not move from his place by the barrels until the last of the lantern light had faded. Then he turned toward the fields where the snow stretched. Endless under the stars' dot in the days that followed, the air in the village thickened. At the well, voices rose louder. In the store, conversations broke off when certain names were spoken. The girl's steps grew slower, her body heavier, her silence deeper. Her mother's eyes followed her with worry that never left. Her father spent more nights in the barn, the smell of drink clinging to him. The sheriff passed by their house more often, though never knocked, never spoke. The preacher visited again, his hands shaking slightly as he prayed over them, words about forgiveness falling like brittle leaves that did not cover the ground. One night the ranch hand returned, against the father's order. He stood in the yard, hat in hand, asking to speak. The girl stepped out, though her father barked at her to stay inside. She looked at the ranch hand, and for the first time she lifted her eyes fully. He said he would take her far, that no one would follow if they left before dawn. His voice was gentle, though edged with desperation. She listened, but her heart did not move. She saw kindness in him, but no bond. She turned away, and the ranch hand stood there a long time, the cold sinking into his bones, before walking back down the road. Meanwhile, the Apache carried his silence like a shield. He worked on fences, fetched water, split wood, yet everywhere he walked, suspicion walked with him. Children watched from doorways. Men's eyes followed him. Women whispered behind shawls. He felt the walls closing, though no one had spoken the charge aloud. He knew it was only a matter of time. A rumor is like a fire under dry leaves. It spreads unseen, until the smoke breaks open. The sheriff began asking questions in earnest. He went to the midwife's cabin, his boots leaving tracks through the thin snow. He asked her if she had tended to the girl. The midwife did not lie, but she gave no names. She said the child would be born with or without the world's blessing, and that was all she would say. The sheriff tipped his hat and left, his face unreadable. Still, the midwife knew her words would be carried back to the village, turned over and twisted in a dozen mouths. By the time spring pushed its first thaw through the fields, tension had grown sharp enough to cut. The preacher planned another gathering, a sermon meant to soothe, though many expected it would not. Whispers spread that the truth must come out there, in the hall, before all eyes. Some said the girl would be forced to speak. Some said the Apache would be dragged in and made to stand before them. Some said the sheriff already knew and was only waiting for the right moment to strike. The night of the gathering, the hall brimmed with bodies. Lanterns glowed against damp walls, and the stove hissed with wood still wet from the thaw. The girl sat with her mother near the back, her shawl pulled close. Her father sat stiff beside them, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on nothing. The preacher spoke, his voice heavy, yet no one truly listened. The blacksmith shifted, waiting. The old woman by the stove crossed her arms, unyielding. The sheriff stood near the door, his hand never far from the pistol at his belt. The Apache came late, walking through the hush of voices that dipped and rose as he passed. He did not look left or right, only forward, his face a mask carved from stone. He took his place near the wall, outside the circle of light, his hand brushing once against the pouch at his side. The girl felt her heart seize when she saw him, though she did not raise her eyes again. The preacher's words bent slowly toward sin and confession, toward truth and judgment. The crowd stirred, restless, murmuring, eyes darting between the girl and the Apache. The blacksmith's hand clenched, his voice bursting out, demanding that the truth be spoken, demanding names. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to deny him. The girl felt her mother's hand tighten on her arm, felt her father shift beside her, felt the heat of every stare burn against her skin. Her throat closed, her breath shallow. The sheriff's eyes swept the room, steady, watching for the moment when the air would break. The Apache lifted his chin slightly, as though preparing to step forward. The girl's hands pressed to her stomach, the child stirring within, the weight of it anchoring her to the floor. The hall pulsed with silence, heavy and sharp. Every heart waited for the words that would end the guessing, the words that would set fire to the night. The preacher's mouth opened, the blacksmith's voice rose, the old woman muttered. The sheriff's hand hovered near his belt, and the girl's breath caught. The night held itself on the edge, one heartbeat away from shattering. The hall trembled with silence as if the walls themselves held their breath. The blacksmith's words still hung in the air, and the crowd leaned forward as one, hungry for a confession that would end the long season of whispers. The girl felt her body sway under the weight of eyes pressing in from every side. Her mother gripped her hand. Her father stared at the floor, but neither shielded her. The preacher raised a hand for calm, his voice beginning to shape words about mercy, but before he could steady the moment, the Apache stepped from the shadows at the edge of the room. He moved slowly, not rushing, each step measured, boots striking wood that echoed louder than any voice. His face was set, his eyes calm but unflinching. The sheriff's hand twitched near his belt, though he did not draw. The Apache stopped. At the center of the hall, where lamplight fell across his shoulders, and he lifted his chin. His words came steady and low, carrying more strength for being spoken plain. He said the child was his, and he would not deny it. He said he would stand for the girl, for the child, and for what was already done. The room erupted. Some shouted that he had no right to remain in the village. Others spat words about shame, about ruin, about sin. A few called for him to be turned out at once, to be driven beyond the ridge. Yet there were also voices softer, uncertain, wondering aloud if it was not better that the child had a father willing to claim him. The preacher stood frozen, his hand on the pulpit, caught between Scripture and the storm. The sheriff's voice finally cut through, commanding silence, his tone sharp enough to bite through the noise. The girl rose from her chair then, her knees trembling, but her back straight. She said what the Apache had spoken was true, and she asked the village not for forgiveness but for understanding. Her voice cracked, but she did not waver. She said she had carried the secret because she feared what would come, but fear could no longer guide her. She spoke of the child as a gift, not a curse, and of her hope that the child might grow free of bitterness. Her words drew a hush deeper than the Apache's had, because they came not from defiance but from quiet strength. Her father stood next. For the first time, he lifted his eyes to the crowd. His face looked older, worn by silence, but his words were clear. He said his daughter was his blood, and he would not cast her out. He said the child was his kin, and he would not let him be called less than any other. His voice shook, but there was steel under it. That declaration changed something in the room. Those who had shouted began to murmur, their anger dulled by the weight of a father's claim. The preacher finally found his voice, and this time it rang stronger. He said sin was not the end of a story, that redemption lived in every choice made after. He spoke of compassion as strength, not weakness. And he reminded the village that judgment belonged to God, not men with quick tongues. His words did not erase the anger, but they gave those willing to show mercy a place to stand. The sheriff, seeing the balance shift, declared that no law had been broken that night, no crime to punish. He said what lay before them was not a matter for his badge but for their hearts. His steady tone carried weight, and the murmurs settled into silence. The blacksmith still glared, but his voice was quiet now. The old woman by the stove nodded once, her sharp eyes softening, as if she had seen enough to know the child would not walk alone. From that night forward, the village did not speak in whispers. Not all hearts softened. Some carried their bitterness, like a badge, muttering whenever the Apache passed. Yet others, having seen him claim what was his, found a measure of respect they had not felt before. He continued his work, fixing fences, tending stock, trading labor for coin or food. Slowly, usefulness overcame suspicion. The girl, though still judged by some, found strength in walking openly with her mother at her side, her father close behind. She did not hide her growing belly anymore. The ranch hand drifted away in the weeks that followed, leaving for a settlement downriver. He carried his quiet disappointment with him, but he bore no grudge. He knew when a path was not his to walk. The midwife visited often, guiding the girl through the trials of each month, her calm presence a shelter against the storms outside. She taught the girl how to breathe through the pain, how to prepare, how to trust that life carried its own rhythm stronger than fear. Spring deepened into summer. The fields greened, the river ran high, and the child arrived one hot afternoon, born in the small cabin where the midwife's herbs filled the air. The girl gripped her mother's hand, tears streaking her face, and when the child's cry filled the room, It felt like a sound louder than any sermon, a sound that demanded to be heard. The midwife laid the child in the girl's arms, small and red and fierce, and for a moment the weight of the village lifted, leaving only the weight of new life. Word spread quickly. Some came to see, cautious but curious. A few brought gifts, rough-hewn toys, a blanket, bread baked fresh. Others stayed away, their silence sharp as knives. Yet no one dared call the child nameless. The father stood openly beside his daughter, and the Apache stood too, no longer in the shadows. The sheriff passed by often, his presence quiet, but firm, a reminder that order was being kept. The preacher visited, blessing the child, his hand trembling as he spoke words of hope into the small room. In time, the storm eased. The village still remembered, but memory dulled, shaped by the sight of the child learning to walk, his laugh carrying across the fields, his mother's strength visible in every step she took. The Apache's steady presence, his work, his silence, became less a mark of difference and more a fact of life in the village. Respect grew in places where suspicion had once thrived. Even the blacksmith, gruff and stubborn, found himself nodding at the Apache one morning after watching him repair a wagon axle with steady hands. Years passed, and the story of the girl and the Apache shifted. What had begun as a scandal grew into something else, a tale told with less anger and more reflection. Some spoke of it as a warning, others as a lesson in courage, others still as proof that truth, however painful, was better than silence. The girl grew into a woman known for her resilience, her quiet dignity. The Apache never sought to be more than he was, but those who had once spat his name now spoke it with a grudging respect. The child, who had once been the reason for whispers, became instead the reason for pride. He grew strong, running the fields, chasing the river, learning both the ways of his mother's people and the wisdom of his father's. He carried both sides within him, and though the village still bore scars, those scars no longer bled. They became part of the story, part of what shaped the place and the people who lived there. Looking back, the girl often thought of the night in the hall, the moment when silence broke and truth stood naked before every eye. She thought of the fear that nearly crushed her, the anger that nearly destroyed them all. Yet she also thought of the strength that rose in the face of that fear, the way her father's voice had steadied, the way the Apache had stepped into the light, the way the preacher had finally spoken mercy. Those moments, heavy as stone, had built the foundation for everything that followed. The village was never perfect, but it endured. It carried forward, shaped by hardship and softened by small mercies. The girl learned that secrets weigh heavier than truth, that silence breeds cruelty, and that courage often looks like speaking when the world would rather you keep quiet. The Apache learned that honor is not in the ease of a choice, but in the cost of it. The father learned that love can outlast shame, and the mother that quiet care is a kind of strength no storm can erase. In the end, the story was not about scandal or shame. It was about survival, about the courage to face a village's judgment and to stand for what could not be undone. It was about finding a way forward when every path seemed closed. It was about the strength of a girl who became a woman, the steadiness of an outsider who became a father, and the endurance of a child born into the center of storm who grew into the light beyond it. And so, the village moved on, the fields tilled, the church bell ringing, the river running as it always had. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms, the memory of that season remained, not as a wound but as a reminder. A reminder that truth, though hard, can carry people through darkness, and that sometimes the most human act is not judgment but mercy.